The 6 ones that we're going to cover in this course are the biological perspective, the psychodynamic perspective, the cognitive perspective, the humanist perspective, the behaviorist perspective, and the sociocultural perspective. For this week, the 2 we're going to focus on are the psychodynamic and the biological. I'm going to go a little out of order and actually start with the psychodynamic perspective, because you actually already heard a little bit about this one in that origin video I had you watch before. So, without further ado, the psychodynamic perspective. And the reason that the origin video talked about this perspective above all the others is because this is the brainchild of Mr. Sigmund Freud, who, as the video mentioned, is really kind of the founder or the father of modern psychology. It's his ideas that really make psychology stand out as its own individual science. Now, there are other debates and things going on at the time, but Sigmund Freud really becomes regarded as the father of modern psychology. And even though you might hear about his perspective and be like, man, what was that guy thinking? A lot of research and study we have to go back and thank him for, because it really made psychology its own science. So his perspective is known today as the psychodynamic perspective. And if it's a little confusing, I'm going to show you some visuals and try to summarize it down to its bare bones to make it more understandable. So 1, our behavior is influenced by unconscious desires and impulses that are typically considered both primitive and unacceptable. And before I jump into what that means, let's go to the next bullet point. Our behavior is usually the result of a battle between these unconscious impulses that we are born with and generally unaware of, and social norms. So Freud believed that inside our mind was this sort of battlefield. And there was what we're aware of, which is social norms, acceptable behavior, the morals that we're taught, kind of the expectations that we have, that both society has for us and that we have for ourselves. And we're aware of those. We have been taught those. We are conscious that those things exist and that this is how we should behave. But at the same time, buried deep, 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 deep down in what he would call our unconscious, or as I'm later going to call in this video, our id, are these sort of primitive, natural-esque impulses that might be deemed unacceptable. Maybe you've had a confrontation with someone. You've been talking to someone and you're just really, really annoyed. You're just so annoyed with them that you kind of maybe get the impulse to like punch them in the face, right? Is that what you should do? Is that what is acceptable based on social norms? Probably not, right? But you have that impulse, and so then you're going to kind of wage this battle of whether you should just let it go, do what's acceptable, kind of ignore them, or whether you're going to actually punch them in the face. And there's this battle going out between what we know is acceptable behavior and those kind of random impulses that kind of come out of nowhere that we had no idea lived inside of us. And now there's this kind of grand battle going on which one we're going to act on. And more often than not, it's the social norms. It's that awareness, those attitudes that we're conscious of that will win out. But on occasion, we might just do something impulsively and have no idea where that came from, because it's not something that we usually regard, it's not a characteristic that we usually regard ourselves as having. So, as I already mentioned, Sigmund Freud introduced this perspective of psychology. He believed that we are typically unaware of the true motives of our behavior, and so in order to discover those motives and solve any behavioral issues, we must psychoanalyze, look at dreams, slips of the tongue, to gain insight into our true nature. So in order to uncover what exists in that unconscious, there are certain methods that he created that he believed unlocked what existed there. So at times when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're sleeping, right, our dreams somehow reveal what might exist in our unconscious, what sort of behaviors might exist that we had no idea we had, or slips of the tongue. These are sometimes called Freudian slips. If you look at the cartoon on the bottom, that is an example of a Freudian slip, or a slip of the tongue, right? Okay, so I'm going to come back in just a second. I'm going to show you some things on the whiteboard that will hopefully make this perspective even more clear. Okay, let's see if we can pull this back just a little bit. All right, so for each one of these perspectives we go over, there are two important questions you're going to have to answer. One, what causes behavior according to that perspective? And two, how do we change behavior? How to change the behavior? How do these psychologists believe that you can change a behavior that you don't like? Okay, or how do we analyze it? So for the psychodynamic approach, according to Freud, what causes behavior are a series of things, right? So the key is that, right, he says there's this constant battle between social norms and our unconscious. And our unconscious is this area where these sort of impulses and natural feelings and urges that we were born with kind of lay dormant for most of our life, and we just don't know that they're there. And so according to Freud, he's going to say, well, our unconscious, right, this kind of battle between our conscious and our unconscious. So the morals and the values that we've learned, that we've obtained, that we understand are kind of the right choices to make. And it's going to be kind of our unconscious versus our conscious. But there's even more, because Freud says there are a lot of things buried in this unconscious that we're not aware of, that we don't know exist until they kind of manifest at the surface in various ways. And so the things that are included in our unconscious may be childhood experiences. It could be repressed or forgotten trauma. So Freud frequently believed that, and we'll talk about this more later on as well, but he believed that when we faced experiences or we faced situations that made us uncomfortable, or that could lead us to behave erratically or poorly, or that we just couldn't deal with, that we use defense mechanisms. And one of these defense mechanisms was repression, kind of a forced forgetfulness. We kind of forced ourselves to forget an experience. And so we could have had past trauma that we have since forgotten, or we have kind of buried so deep in our unconscious that we've forgotten it's there, or we've forgotten that it happened. He said this was especially he felt this could especially be the case in forgotten childhood experiences, that something could have happened to you when you were so young that you just kind of completely forgot it, but it still exists. There's a memory of it that exists deep, deep, deep down that's just inaccessible. You can't access it. That you cannot consciously access your unconscious, and so it's almost impossible to know what exists in there. And so this is what Freud believed caused behavior. So every behavior was caused between this battle. Now, let's say an impulse comes up, right? We behave in a way that we're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know I had that in me. I didn't know that was a trait I had. And maybe this is troubling. Maybe it's something you want to fix. So when it comes to changing behavior, Freud believed it's central to understand what exists here. We have to understand what exists in our unconscious in order to change it, in order to change the way we behave. Because if we keep going as we go and have no idea what exists in there, there's no way we can change it or prepare for it. And so Freud was a big fan of kind of talk therapy of such. So this would be kind of, you would go in and you would meet with a psychologist, you'd meet with a therapist, and you kind of talk out things. And he believed that this was, kind of talking about past experiences may be able to kind of bring light or help you remember them. He also believed in dream analysis. That one of the best ways we could find out what existed in our unconscious was to look at what occurs when we are at our most vulnerable, what occurs when we aren't aware of what's going on around us. And so looking at our dreams, it's not and interpreting them, understanding that maybe a situation that happens in a dream has greater meaning. Or looking at those times where we're the most vulnerable. So talk therapy, dream analysis, we have to uncover what exists in our unconscious and then understand that that behavior exists within us, and then work on changing it and work through it. And so things like talk therapy, dream analysis, anything that allowed you to uncover what existed in your unconscious. Because once you knew what was there, you could prepare for it. You could come up with ways to avoid situations that might bring up those impulses that were, deemed unacceptable or primitive or whatever. So this is just an overview of the psychodynamic perspective. If you're still confused, ask questions. Please ask questions. Email me. Come to class with them. We'll go over them. Awesome.